The grip of drought that is intensifying in the West has led scientists to turn to an unusual ally in the fight to limit the effects of climate change. We're talking about the largest rodent in North America, the beaver.
In the high desert of eastern Oregon, there's a stream that used to be left for dead. It's called Bridge Creek, a modest tributary feeding into the John Day River. And by the late 2000s, it had stopped behaving like a healthy waterway altogether. Instead of spreading gently across its valley the way streams in this region once did, it had carved itself into a deep, narrow gash in the earth, a vertical walled trench that looked more like an irrigation ditch than a river. Scientists studying it weren't just worried. They were preparing for the very real possibility that this stream and the threatened fish that depended on it were beyond saving by conventional means. So a small team tried something that sounded almost absurd. They didn't bring in bulldozers or pour concrete. They didn't relocate beavers from somewhere else. Instead, in the fall of 2009, a crew waded into the creek and hammered 76 wooden posts into the streambed, then wove willow branches between them. Crude, leaky, deliberately flimsy structures built to imitate the work of an animal that was already living in the stream and already failing to fix it. What happened over the following years became one of the most remarkable restoration stories in modern river science. And it started with a simple question. What if the solution to a broken ecosystem wasn't to build something new, but to give an exhausted native engineer just enough of a head start to finish the job itself? To understand why this mattered, you have to understand what had gone wrong in the first place. Bridge Creek wasn't always a trench. A century and a half ago, this watershed, roughly 270 square miles of arid high desert, held a sprawling, braided network of shallow channels and wetland meadows. Water didn't rush through in a single fast current. It spread out, soaked into the ground, and trickled back out slowly over the dry months. The reason it behaved this way wasn't an accident of geology. It was beavers. Generations of dams had backed up water across the valley floor, trapping sediment, recharging groundwater, and turning the whole landscape into something like a giant sponge that released moisture steadily through the heat of summer. That sponge unraveled in the 1800s, when fur trappers swept through the American West and stripped beaver populations down to almost nothing. Without dams holding it back, water that once spread wide began funneling into a single fast channel. Livestock grazing compounded the damage, stripping away the willows and shrubs that had anchored the banks. And once a stream starts cutting downward into its own bed, it tends to keep cutting. Faster water erodes harder. Harder erosion deepens the channel. A deeper channel concentrates the water even more, which speeds it up further. It's a feedback loop, and by the time scientists began monitoring Bridge Creek seriously in the mid-2000s, that loop had been running unchecked for roughly a century. The consequences for wildlife were severe. The water table, the level of moisture sitting in the soil around the stream, had dropped so far below the surface that cottonwoods and willows along the old banks were dying of thirst, their roots stranded high above water they could no longer reach. In summer, the exposed, sun-baked trench routinely warmed to temperatures lethal for steelhead trout, a threatened species that depends on this exact stream to spawn. Steelhead are resilient fish, capable of migrating enormous distances from the ocean to freshwater breeding grounds. But they cannot survive water that simply gets too hot, and Bridge Creek had become exactly that kind of trap. Here's the part that surprises most people. Beavers had never fully disappeared from Bridge Creek. A handful of small colonies clung on through the 1990s and 2000s, and they never stopped trying to do their job. Survey data showed they were building around 40 dams a year on average. But without mature trees or thick shrubs left along the banks, all they had to build with were thin, brittle willow shoots, and the floods tearing through the narrow trench were violent enough that nearly 9 out of every 10 of those dams failed within 5 years. This wasn't a story about lazy or incapable beavers. It was a story about an animal doing exactly what it had evolved to do, in an environment that had been so badly damaged it no longer gave that effort a fighting chance. This is the insight that shaped the entire project. The problem wasn't biological, it was physical. The team, drawing on research from scientists affiliated with NOAA Fisheries and Utah State University, concluded that adding more beavers to the stream wouldn't fix anything, because the beavers already there were trying their hardest and still losing. What the river needed wasn't more workers. It needed its physics changed just enough that the workers already on site could finally win. That's where the Beaver Dam analogs came in, the technical term for those 76 fake structures. The design philosophy behind them deliberately broke with how engineers normally approach river restoration. Conventional fixes tend to rely on rigid, unyielding barriers, poured concrete, anchored boulders, steel-reinforced log jams, all built to resist the force of moving water head-on. The trouble with that approach is that water doesn't simply give up when it meets resistance. It concentrates its energy at every weak point until something fails. The fake beaver dams took the opposite strategy. They were built to be porous and somewhat fragile, allowing water to seep through during normal flow and spill safely over the top during floods, rather than slamming into a wall. The goal was never to outlast the river permanently. It was just to survive one flood season long enough to give the resident beavers a stable platform to build on. The construction itself was almost absurdly low-tech. Crews stood in the streambed with a hand-operated post pounder, drove wooden fence posts into the gravel in a line across the channel, spaced them roughly a third of a meter apart, and wove fresh willow branches horizontally between them, layer over layer, like a loose wicker fence standing in moving water. That was the entire structure. No machinery beyond hand tools, no concrete, no imported rock. The beavers noticed almost immediately. Within the first season, roughly a quarter of the new structures had been occupied and reinforced by beavers weaving in their own material. Nobody trained or guided them to do this. They simply responded to the sound and feel of slowed pond water, which is the signal beavers are instinctively drawn to. Then came the real test. The spring flood of 2010, the same seasonal surge that had wiped out natural beaver dams on this creek for decades. If the human-built frames failed the way every prior structure had, the project would have ended there. They didn't fail. Most came through intact, and the few breaches that occurred were small enough that the beavers patched them within days. For the first time in a generation, a flood left the beavers with something to repair instead of something to rebuild from scratch. From there, the recovery began compounding on itself. Sediment that had been racing straight through the trench for decades started settling out behind the structures, gradually raising the streambed. As the bed rose, the water table around it rose too, by 1 to 3 feet across the treated sections, according to monitoring wells. That rising water reached the root zones of the dying willows on the terraces above, and the plants responded by sending out fresh growth, which gave the beavers their first decent building material in years. Better building material meant stronger, more numerous dams, which trapped more sediment, which raised the water table further. The same destructive feedback loop that had hollowed the river out for a century was now running in reverse. And unlike the original 76 structures, this new growth required no further human construction. By 2012, there were 121 human-built structures spread through the watershed. When survey crews walked the full length of Bridge Creek in 2013 and counted every dam, human-made and natural, the total came to 236. That meant 115 entirely new dams had appeared with no human involvement at all, many of them in side channels and tributaries the original project had never touched. The Beavers had expanded the restoration on their own initiative, faster than any construction crew could have managed. Satellite imagery later confirmed the scale of the change. The total wetted surface area of the stream increased by as much as 203%, and vegetation greenness along the banks rose roughly 20% as willows and sedges recolonized ground that had been bare dirt for decades. Then came the finding nobody expected. Standard stream science predicts that ponding water behind dams should make a creek warmer, not cooler, since slow, shallow, sunlit water typically heats up faster than a fast-moving channel. Researchers genuinely worried the project might inadvertently push Bridge Creek's already dangerous summer temperatures even higher. Instead, monitoring published in 2017 showed daily maximum summer temperatures in the Beaver Dam sections dropping by as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius, with sensors detecting temperature variations of more than 8 degrees across very short distances within the dam complexes. Pockets of cold water sitting just meters from warm. The explanation lay underground. Beneath gravel-bedded streams, there's a zone where surface water and groundwater mix, known as the hyperrheic zone. On the scoured, fast-flowing trench Bridge Creek had become, this exchange had nearly shut down because there was no pressure pushing water downward into the gravel. The weight of water pond behind hundreds of dams changed that, forcing warm surface water down into the cool earth below, where it lost heat before resurfacing further downstream as cold seeps. The Beavers had inadvertently built a natural cooling system, something no engineered restoration project had managed to replicate using concrete or steel. There was a second worry, too, that hundreds of new dams might block migrating fish from reaching their spawning grounds, the way artificial dams historically have. The data said otherwise. Before the project, about 92% of tagged spawning fish successfully navigated the creek. Afterward, with more than 200 dams in place, that figure held steady at just over 93%. The dam complexes had created plunge pools and side channels that functioned like resting stations, turning what had been a relentless, featureless chute into something closer to a staircase with landings. By 2016, after 8 years of monitoring, the results were almost hard to believe. Compared to untreated stretches of the creek, the Beaver-engineered sections showed a 52% increase in juvenile steelhead survival, a 168% increase in fish density, and a 175% increase in total fish biomass, meaning the surviving fish weren't just more numerous, they were larger and healthier too. Researchers described it as the largest documented improvement in threatened steelhead productivity from any habitat restoration effort in the entire Columbia River Basin, a river system where billions of dollars have historically gone toward fish ladders, hatcheries, and engineered infrastructure. And the cost of all this was almost laughably small. The entire human intervention, those original 76 starter structures and their later additions, cost around $374,000. A traditional, machinery-heavy restoration of the same stretch of creek would likely have cost somewhere between $3.5 million and $34 million. And unlike the Beaver-driven system, it would have begun deteriorating the moment construction crews left. The original wooden posts have mostly rotted away by now, exactly as planned. They were never meant to be permanent. They were scaffolding, holding the structure together just long enough for the real builders to take over. And take over they did, continuing to expand, repair, and improve the system every year since, without another dollar spent. The method pioneered at Bridge Creek has since spread to Colorado, Utah, Idaho, Nevada, and California, with agencies increasingly fast-tracking permits to use it elsewhere. What makes the story so striking isn't just that it worked, but how little it required. No new animals were introduced. No machinery reshaped the landscape. The team didn't build a river. They removed one small obstacle standing between a struggling native engineer and the job it had been trying and failing to do for a century. Sometimes the most effective fix for a broken system isn't a bigger intervention. It's recognizing what's already trying to repair itself and giving it just enough of a foothold to finish the work on its own.